The autumn of 1962 descended upon New York City not with a whisper, but with a sudden, biting chill that swept off the Hudson River and stripped the trees of their golden leaves. It was the kind of wind that made the city feel sharp, unforgiving, and restless. In Harlem, the cold drove the numbers runners into the doorways of bodegas and sent the jazz musicians hurrying from cab to club with their coat collars turned up against the frost. But down on Park Avenue, the wind seemed to lose its teeth, buffered by the towering fortresses of limestone and marble that housed the city's elite. Park Avenue was a different world. It was a world of quiet money, of pristine sidewalks, and of brass plaques polished so perfectly they looked like liquid gold. It was here, among the quiet hum of wealth, that Elise Johnson found herself on a Tuesday afternoon. Elise was not a typical 20-year-old. She was royalty, though the newspapers of the day would never print such a title. She was the daughter of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. She carried herself with the innate elegance and ironclad posture of a woman who had been raised by a king and a queen. Her mother, Mame, had taught her how to walk into a room and command it without saying a word. Her father had taught her how to read the shadows in that room. Today, Elise was visiting the clinic of Dr. Arthur Sterling for a routine physical required for her university enrollment. Sterling's name was spoken with a hushed, almost religious reverence among the upper crust of Manhattan society. He was the physician to judges, to Broadway producers, to senators. Getting an appointment with him was a status symbol, a testament to one's connections. Bumpy Johnson, whose reach extended far beyond the borders of 110th Street, had made exactly one phone call to secure the slot. He wanted the best for his daughter. He wanted her to have the world. He didn't know he was sending her into a cage. Elise stepped out of the yellow taxi, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She wore a tailored wool coat in a deep houndstooth pattern, a silk scarf tied neatly at her neck, and a pair of leather gloves. She looked impeccable, but as she approached the heavy, dark oak doors of the clinic, a faint, unexplainable chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. She ignored it, attributing it to the universal anxiety of doctors' offices, and pushed through the doors. The waiting room was an exercise in intimidation through luxury. It did not smell of antiseptic or illness. It smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and a faint, cloying hint of lavender. Heavy velvet drapes framed the tall windows, blocking out the afternoon sun and casting the room in a perpetual dim twilight. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner, a slow, methodical sound that seemed to stretch the seconds into minutes. The receptionist, a woman with tight curls and a tighter smile, looked up from her ledger. Her eyes darted over Elise, taking in the color of her skin, the quality of her coat, and the quiet confidence in her posture. The receptionist's smile did not reach her eyes. "May I help you?" the woman asked, her tone dripping with that specific brand of polite condescension reserved for those deemed out of place. "Elise Johnson," Elise said, her voice steady and clear, carrying the unmistakable cadence of an expensive education. "I have a 3 o'clock appointment with Dr. Sterling." The receptionist checked the ledger, her perfectly manicured finger tracing down the column of names. She paused. "Ah, yes. Have a seat, Miss Johnson. The doctor will be with you shortly." Elise chose a high-backed leather wing chair near the corner. She folded her gloved hands in her lap and waited. The ticking of the clock grew louder. The other patients in the room, a matron in a mink stole, an older gentleman reading the Wall Street Journal, did not look at her directly, but Elise could feel the weight of their peripheral stares. She was accustomed to this. It was the tax of moving through the white world. But the atmosphere in this particular room felt heavier, thicker, almost suffocating. 20 minutes crawled by. Then, 30. The heavy wooden door leading to the examination rooms finally clicked open. Dr. Arthur Sterling stepped out. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair swept back from a patrician forehead, wearing a pristine, blindingly white lab coat over a tailored gray suit. He possessed the kind of handsome, weathered face that inspired instant trust, a face that had graced the pages of medical journals and philanthropic brochures. But when his eyes landed on Elise, something flickered behind the polished veneer. It was a look of calculation, a look of hungry appraisal. "Miss Johnson," Sterling said, his voice a rich, soothing baritone designed to calm anxious patients. "My apologies for the delay. Please come with me." Elise stood, her posture perfect, and followed the doctor down a long, narrow hallway. The carpet was thick, muffling their footsteps completely. The walls were lined with framed diplomas, awards, and photographs of Sterling shaking hands with powerful men. It was a gallery of unassailable authority. He led her to an examination room at the very end of the hall, furthest from the waiting area. "In here, please," he murmured, gesturing for her to enter. Elise stepped inside. The room was small, dominated by a heavy, leather-padded examination table and a stainless steel tray holding various medical instruments that gleamed coldly under the fluorescent lights. Sterling followed her in. And then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, he reached behind him and turned the lock on the heavy oak door. The metallic click echoed in the small space like the cocking of a pistol. Elise's breath hitched just for a fraction of a second. The lessons of her father kicked in immediately. Never show fear. Fear is a currency, and you never give it away for free. "Is it standard practice to lock the door, doctor?" Elise asked, keeping her voice light, conversational, though her heart had begun to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Sterling smiled. It was not the soothing smile from the waiting room. It was a slow, arrogant smirk. The mask was slipping. "Privacy is paramount in my practice, Elise," he said, using her first name with a familiar, oily intimacy that made her skin crawl. "We wouldn't want any interruptions. Some of my high-profile patients demand absolute discretion. I find it's a good habit to keep." He stepped closer. The room suddenly felt incredibly small. The smell of his cologne, expensive, heavy with musk and bay rum, was overpowering. He did not move toward the sink to wash his hands. He did not reach for a stethoscope. He moved toward her. "You are a remarkably beautiful young woman," Sterling said softly, his eyes dropping from her face to scan the lines of her figure beneath her coat. "I must admit, when your appointment was booked, I didn't expect someone with such refinement. Your people don't often find their way to my clinic." The racism was casual, woven seamlessly into the predatory advance. Elise stiffened, her chin lifting. "I am here for a physical examination for my university entrance, Dr. Sterling. Nothing more." Of course," he purred, taking another step. He was close enough now that she could see the fine pores on his nose, the slight yellowing of his teeth. "But medicine is an art, Elise. It requires a thorough understanding of the patient, a deep, intimate understanding." He reached out, his hand hovering over the lapel of her coat. Elise stepped back instantly, her spine hitting the cold edge of the examination table. She was trapped. "Do not touch me," Elise said. Her voice was no longer polite. It was cold, carrying the unmistakable razor-sharp edge of the Johnson lineage. Sterling paused, his hand suspended in the air. A flash of irritation crossed his features, quickly replaced by a dark, amused arrogance. He was a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. He was a man who believed that his white coat and his Park Avenue address made him a god. He looked at this young black woman and saw only vulnerability. He saw someone who had no voice, no power, and no recourse in his world. "You're making a mistake, my dear," Sterling whispered, his voice dropping to a menacing rasp. "You are in my clinic, behind a locked door. Do you know who I am? Do you know the men I play golf with, the judges I dine with?" He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her cheek. "I can write a report right now that says you are psychologically unfit for university. I can ruin your reputation before your life even begins. Or we can be friendly. We can be very, very friendly, and I will ensure that every door in this city opens for you." It was a classic trap. The exertion of power, the threat of ruin. Sterling expected her to crumble. He expected tears, pleading, or terrified submission. He had done this before. He knew the script. But he didn't know who he was talking to. Elise didn't cry. She didn't shake. She looked Dr. Arthur Sterling dead in the eye, and for a fleeting second, the doctor saw a darkness in the young woman's gaze that made him instinctively recoil. "Unlock the door," Elise commanded. "You arrogant little," Sterling began, his face flushing with sudden, ugly anger. He reached for her arm, moving to grab her. Elise was faster. She grabbed the heavy steel reflex hammer from the medical tray next to her and brought it down with lightning speed, not on his head, but hard across his knuckles. Sterling let out a sharp yelp of pain, stumbling backward and clutching his hand. The shock on his face was absolute. In his world, victims did not fight back. Elise didn't wait for him to recover. She threw her shoulder against the man, shoving him off balance, and lunged for the door. Her hands moved frantically over the heavy brass deadbolt. She twisted it, ripped the door open, and bolted into the quiet, carpeted hallway. "You little tramp," Sterling hissed from inside the room, his voice a venomous whisper, mindful even in his rage not to alert the waiting room. "I'll see you destroyed. I'll see you in the gutter." Elise didn't look back. She walked down the hallway, forcing herself not to run. She kept her head high, her breathing shallow and controlled. She passed the receptionist, who looked up with a questioning frown, but Elise offered no explanation. She pushed through the heavy oak doors and burst out onto the sidewalk of Park Avenue. The cold autumn wind hit her face, a shocking, welcome relief. She walked for 2 blocks before her legs began to tremble. She ducked into the alcove of a closed boutique, leaning against the cold glass, and finally let out a ragged breath. She was safe, but the terror was rapidly being replaced by something else. A deep, burning humiliation, and beneath that humiliation, an icy, inherited rage. She hailed a taxi. She didn't give the driver an address on Sugar Hill. She gave him the address of a specific social club on 125th Street. The drive uptown felt like crossing a border between 2 warring nations. As the yellow cab navigated the traffic, passing the museum and moving deeper into Harlem, the polished limestone gave way to brick and fire escapes. The quiet hum of money was replaced by the loud, vibrant, chaotic symphony of the streets. This was her kingdom. This was where she was safe. The cab pulled up in front of a nondescript storefront. The windows were blacked out, and a pair of massive men in sharp suits stood by the door, smoking cigarettes and watching the street with predatory eyes. As Elise stepped out of the cab, one of the men, a hulking figure named Nat, immediately dropped his cigarette and straightened up. "Miss Elise," Nat said, his voice a low rumble of surprise. "Everything all right? "You look pale. I need to see my father, Nat," Elise said tightly. "Right now." Nat didn't ask questions. He opened the door and escorted her through the dim, smoke-filled front room of the club, past tables of men playing cards and talking in hushed tones. The music was low, a mournful saxophone playing from a jukebox in the corner. As they passed, the men stopped talking. They recognized the boss's daughter. They recognized the look on her face. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the casual relaxation turning into a taut, coiled tension. At the back of the club, behind a heavy wooden door guarded by another man, was Bumpy Johnson's office. The door opened. The office was simple, smelling of rich Cuban tobacco and old leather. Bumpy Johnson was sitting at a felt-covered table, playing a game of chess against his oldest and most dangerous friend, Illinois Gordon. Bumpy wore a tailored gray suit, his fedora resting on a stand nearby. He was a man who radiated authority without making a sound. He held a chess piece in his hand, his eyes scanning the board, his mind 3 moves ahead. "Check," Bumpy murmured softly. "You always set the trap on the bishop's file, Bumpy." "One of these days, I'm going to see it coming," Illinois replied, leaning back and taking a drag of his cigarette. Elise stepped into the room. Bumpy didn't immediately look up. He felt the shift in the air. He felt the presence of his daughter, but he also felt the jagged, frantic energy she carried with her. Slowly, he placed the chess piece down. He raised his head. His eyes, usually warm and gentle when looking at Elise, narrowed fractionally. He saw the slight tremor in her hands. He saw the way she was clutching her handbag. He saw the pale, tight set of her jaw. Bumpy stood up. The movement was smooth, but there was a sudden, terrifying weight to it. The entire room seemed to shrink. Illinois Gordon stopped smoking. He slowly crushed his cigarette into an ashtray, his eyes locking onto Elise. "Elise," Bumpy said. His voice was a soft velvet purr, betraying absolutely no emotion. But those who knew him understood that this quiet tone was far more dangerous than any shout. "What happened?" Elise took a breath. The tears that she had refused to shed on Park Avenue finally threatened to spill, but she forced them back. She was a Johnson. She would report the facts. "I went to the clinic," Elise said, her voice shaking slightly before she steadied it. "Dr. Sterling's clinic, for the physical." Bumpy nodded once. "Go on." She told him everything. She described the waiting room. She described the heavy oak door. She described the click of the lock. She repeated Sterling's words, the oily tone of his voice, the casual racism, the threat to her reputation, the attempt to grab her. She told him how she had hit the doctor with the reflex hammer and ran. As she spoke, the silence in the room became absolute. It was a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure pressing against the eardrums. Illinois Gordon sat perfectly still, his eyes turning blank and flat, the look of a man who was already calculating the logistics of a body disposal. Bumpy didn't interrupt. He didn't gasp. He didn't pace the floor or punch a wall. He simply stood there, listening to every single word, his face carved from dark stone. The only sign that he was processing the information was the slow, rhythmic clenching and unclenching of his left hand at his side. When Elise finished, she looked at her father. She expected rage. She expected to see the monster that the newspapers wrote about. Instead, Bumpy walked over to her. He gently took her trembling hands in his own. His hands were warm, calloused, and incredibly strong. He kissed her forehead. "Did he touch you, baby girl?" Bumpy asked, his whisper barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. "No," Elise said. "I got out." Bumpy closed his eyes for a long, slow second. When he opened them, the warmth was entirely gone. They were the eyes of a shark cruising through deep black water. "You did exactly right," Bumpy said, smoothing the lapel of her coat. "You are your mother's daughter. You have the heart of a lion." He turned to the door. Nat, the massive bodyguard, stepped into the room instantly. "Take Elise home," Bumpy ordered. "Stay at the door. Do not let anyone in unless it's me or Mame. Understand?" "Yes, Mr. Johnson," Nat said, his voice grim. Elise looked at her father. "Daddy, he said he knows judges. He said he has powerful friends. He said he would ruin me." Bumpy offered a small, terrifying smile. "Dr. Sterling knows men in robes, Elise. He knows men who write laws on pieces of paper. But he doesn't know me. And by the time the sun goes down today, Dr. Sterling is going to learn that the most powerful men in this city don't wear robes. They wear shadows." He kissed her cheek one more time. "Go home. Make yourself some tea. This is already handled." Elise nodded and let Nat lead her out of the office. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The room descended back into silence. Illinois Gordon slowly stood up from the chessboard. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He walked over to a heavy iron safe in the corner of the room, spun the dial, and pulled out a snub-nosed revolver, checking the cylinder out of pure habit before sliding it into his shoulder holster. Bumpy walked over to his desk. He picked up the heavy black rotary telephone. He dialed a number from memory. Yeah, a voice answered on the other end. "I need a name," Bumpy said softly. "A white name. Someone quiet. Someone who pays in cash." "Mr. Smith," the voice suggested. "Charles Smith." "Fine," Bumpy said. "Call the clinic of Dr. Arthur Sterling on Park Avenue. Tell them Mr. Charles Smith requires an urgent, private consultation. Tell them money is no object. Tell them he will pay triple the rate if the doctor can see him after hours, as the very last appointment of the day. When the staff has gone home. Consider it done, Bumpy." Bumpy hung up the phone. He walked over to the hat stand and picked up his fedora, setting it on his head with meticulous care. He looked at Illinois Gordon. A doctor, Bumpy mused quietly, almost to himself. A man who takes an oath to do no harm. A man who thinks his degree and his zip code give him the right to lock a door on a young girl and treat her like an animal. Bumpy struck a match and lit a fresh cigar, the flame illuminating the icy resolve in his eyes. "He likes to lock doors, Illinois." "I can appreciate a man who likes his privacy," Illinois said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Makes it easier for us." "We are going to go downtown," Bumpy said, exhaling a thick cloud of blue smoke. "We are going to give the good doctor a consultation on anatomy, and we are going to make sure that he never ever forgets the name Johnson." The sun began its slow descent over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, bleeding shadows across the concrete canyons. The temperature dropped further, the autumn wind howling through the avenues like a chorus of ghosts. At 5:45, the receptionist at Dr. Sterling's clinic locked the petty cash drawer, put on her coat, and knocked lightly on the doctor's office door. "Dr. Sterling?" she called out. The door opened. Sterling stood there, looking slightly agitated, massaging his bruised knuckles. He had spent the last 3 hours fuming, his arrogance wounded, his mind racing with vindictive plans on how to destroy Elise Johnson's academic future. "Yes, Margaret. What is it?" he snapped. "I'm leaving for the day, doctor. The waiting room is empty. But remember, you agreed to take that urgent consultation. Mr. Charles Smith. He should be arriving at 6 o'clock. Sterling sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yes, yes, the cash patient. I remember. You can go, Margaret. Lock the front door on your way out. I'll let Mr. Smith in when he buzzes." "Have a good evening, Doctor," Margaret said, hurrying away, eager to escape his foul mood. Sterling retreated into his office, pouring himself a generous glass of scotch from a crystal decanter on his desk. He took a sip, the liquid burning a pleasant trail down his throat. He looked at his bruised hand. Little tramp, he thought again, the rage bubbling up. She thinks she can walk away from me. I'll make a phone call to the admissions board tomorrow. I'll say she exhibited violent, hysterical tendencies. I'll bury her. He smiled, taking another sip of the scotch. The world always bent to his will. It was the natural order of things. At precisely 6 o'clock, the buzzer echoed through the empty clinic. Sterling set his glass down, adjusted his pristine white coat, and walked down the silent, carpeted hallway toward the front entrance. The clinic was dark, save for the emergency lights and the warm glow spilling from his office. He reached the heavy glass doors of the lobby. Standing on the other side, obscured by the twilight and the glare of the street lamps, were 2 men. They were wearing dark suits and fedoras, their collars turned up against the wind. Sterling couldn't see their faces clearly. He assumed the man in front was Mr. Charles Smith, and the hulking figure behind him was a driver or an associate. Sterling unlocked the door and pulled it open, pasting on his most reassuring professional smile. "Mr. Smith, I presume?" Sterling said, his rich baritone echoing in the quiet lobby. "I am Dr. Sterling. Please, come in out of the cold." The first man stepped over the threshold. The dim light of the lobby washed over him, revealing a tailored charcoal suit, a burgundy tie, and a face carved from dark stone. The man removed his fedora, holding it by the brim. He didn't look like a nervous patient. He looked like an apex predator stepping into a pen. Sterling's smile faltered. His eyes flicked to the second man stepping inside. Illinois Gordon moved with a terrifying, silent grace for a man of his size. He didn't look at the doctor. He simply reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, and pulled it shut. Click. Illinois reached up and slid the heavy deadbolt into place. He then reached into his coat, pulled out a pair of thick leather gloves, and began to put them on, finger by finger. Sterling's heart gave a sudden, violent lurch. The air in the lobby instantly dropped 20 degrees. The primal instincts that civilized men pretend to ignore were suddenly screaming in the doctor's brain. Flight. Danger. "Excuse me," Sterling stammered, taking a step backward, his voice losing its confident resonance. "Who are you?" "The appointment was for a Mr. Charles Smith. If you are not him, I must ask you to leave. The clinic is closed." Bumpy Johnson did not move. He stood perfectly still, looking at the doctor with eyes that contained no anger, no malice, and absolutely no mercy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his silver cigarette case. "The clinic is closed," Bumpy repeated softly, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in the quiet room. "Yes, doctor. The clinic is officially closed." Sterling looked at the deadbolt. He looked at the massive man in the leather gloves. He looked back at Bumpy. The arrogance that had fueled him all day suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping terror. He realized, with sudden, crystal clarity, that the lock on the door was no longer meant to keep the world out. It was meant to keep him in. The silence that followed the heavy, metallic click of the deadbolt was not empty. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating, like a wool blanket soaked in ice water suddenly thrown over Dr. Arthur Sterling's head. In the rarefied air of Park Avenue, silence was usually a luxury. It was the sound of a private club, of a chauffeur-driven limousine, of a Swiss bank vault. But this silence was different. This was the silence of deep water. The silence of a trap springing shut in the dead of night. Sterling stood frozen on the plush cream-colored carpet of his own reception area. His breath trapped itself in his throat, burning his lungs. His eyes, normally so confident and appraising, darted wildly around the dim space. The only illumination came from the amber glow of the street lamps filtering through the heavy glass of the front doors, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. To his left, the massive form of Illinois Gordon was completely still. The man had not spoken a word since he reached out and locked the door. He didn't need to. He was currently engaged in the slow, methodical process of pulling on a pair of thick, black leather driving gloves. He smoothed the leather over his knuckles, stretching the material taut over his massive, calloused hands. The sound, a soft, dry creak of animal hide stretching, echoed in the silent room with the finality of a judge breaking his gavel. Illinois smoothed the thumb of the right glove, his face a mask of bored professional indifference. He wasn't looking at the doctor. He was looking at the lock, ensuring the mechanism was secure. He was a man who appreciated a well-sealed room. Then, Sterling's frantic gaze snapped back to the center of the lobby. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood with the relaxed, effortless posture of a man standing in his own living room. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the dim light, a pristine white shirt, and a deep burgundy tie perfectly knotted at his throat. He held his fedora loosely in his left hand by the brim. He did not adopt a fighting stance. He did not reach into his coat for a weapon. He didn't puff out his chest or attempt to look intimidating. The sheer gravitational pull of his presence did the work for him. He radiated a supreme, terrifying authority that pushed all the oxygen out of the room. Bumpy brought his right hand up, the silver cigarette case gleaming briefly in the shadows. He didn't pull a cigarette. He drew a long, thick, dark-leaf Cuban cigar. He produced a silver lighter, flicked the wheel, and held the flame to the tip. He took a slow, deliberate draw, rotating the cigar to ensure an even burn. The tip glowed a fierce, angry red, casting a brief, hellish illumination over his sharply sculpted features. In that momentary flash of light, Sterling saw a face carved from dark mahogany and old scars, a face that had looked death in the eye 1,000 times and never blinked. Bumpy exhaled, and a thick blue-gray plume of smoke coiled upward toward the crystal chandelier hanging dormant above them. The rich, earthy smell of the expensive tobacco immediately overpowered the faint, cloying scent of lemon oil and lavender that usually defined the waiting room. The smell of the street had invaded the sanctuary. "Who are you?" Sterling managed to ask again. He intended the question to sound authoritative, to demand an answer worthy of his station. Instead, his rich, soothing, highly trained baritone deteriorated into a thin, reedy squeak. It was the sound of a cornered rabbit. The false bravado of his wealthy existence was rapidly melting away under the ice-cold, unblinking stare of the king of Harlem. "A father," Bumpy said softly. The two words drifted through the stagnant air, carrying a weight that forced Sterling to take a physical step backward. The syllables were spoken barely above a whisper, yet they struck the doctor like physical blows. Sterling's breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out across his patrician forehead, stinging his eyes. His mind raced into a state of frantic overdrive, sifting through his mental Rolodex of secrets, flipping through the long, dark history of his indiscretions behind locked examination doors. Which one was this? Which girl had finally brought the wolf to his door? He had always been so careful. He only chose the vulnerable ones, the ones without voices, the ones whose families wouldn't have the resources to challenge a man of his standing. And then, the memory of that very afternoon crashed into his consciousness with the force of a runaway train. The beautiful, regal young black woman with the houndstooth coat and the piercing, intelligent eyes, the one who hadn't lowered her gaze, the one who hadn't cowered when he cornered her, the one who had fought back with the sudden, shocking ferocity of a cornered lioness. Miss Johnson," Sterling stammered, his face draining of all remaining color until it matched the pristine, blinding white of his tailored lab coat. His knees suddenly felt weak, trembling beneath the fine wool of his gray trousers. You're her father. You have an excellent memory, Doctor," Bumpy murmured. His voice was as smooth and dark as aged bourbon, completely and utterly devoid of anger. That was the most terrifying part for Sterling. A screaming man is a man out of control. A screaming man is ruled by his emotions, and emotions can be manipulated. A screaming man can be bargained with, outsmarted, distracted, or eventually reasoned down. But the man standing before Sterling was entirely, completely in control. His heart rate had not elevated. His breathing was slow and rhythmic. He was a force of nature, a slow-moving glacier of consequence that was prepared to crush everything in its path without making a single sound. "An excellent memory," Bumpy repeated, taking another slow draw from the cigar and letting the smoke drift from his nostrils. "It's a vital skill in the medical profession, isn't it? Remembering details, knowing exactly where the nerves run beneath the skin, knowing exactly where to press, where to cut, where to apply pressure to get the desired result." Bumpy took a single step forward. The soles of his polished wingtips made absolutely no sound on the thick carpet. It was a predator's walk. I can explain," Sterling said, his voice rising in pitch, a desperate edge of hysteria bleeding into his tone. He took another step backward, his shoulder blades bumping hard against the heavy, solid mahogany of the receptionist's desk. The impact jarred him, but he was grateful for the physical support. His hands were shaking so violently he had to reach behind him and grip the polished edge of the wood just to keep from collapsing to the floor. "It was a misunderstanding," Sterling blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "A terrible, terrible misunderstanding. I swear to you, I was merely conducting a thorough examination. It's standard procedure for a university physical. She misinterpreted my actions. She became hysterical. You know how young women can be, Mr. Johnson. Highly emotional, prone to exaggeration. She panicked. It was completely unfounded. Illinois Gordon let out a sound. It wasn't a laugh. A laugh implies joy or humor. This was a low, guttural rasp that started deep in his massive chest, a sound like gravel grinding against rusted steel. It was the sound of a veteran executioner amused by the desperate, predictable bleeding of his prey on the scaffold. Bumpy didn't laugh. His expression didn't change by a millimeter. He simply stopped walking. He stood about 6 feet away from Sterling, studying the trembling doctor with the detached, analytical curiosity of a scientist examining a particularly repulsive insect squirming under a microscope. "Hysterical," Bumpy repeated. He rolled the word around in his mouth, tasting the syllables as if they were a foul, expired medicine. He looked at the glowing end of his cigar, then back at the doctor. "That is a very convenient word, isn't it, Doc? A very old, very tired trick. A magic trick played by men in suits." Bumpy slowly began to pace, taking 3 steps to the left, his eyes never leaving Sterling's face. "You put on that white coat," Bumpy said, his voice a low, hypnotic hum that filled the lobby. You hang those fancy gold-embossed degrees on your wall. You rent an office on Park Avenue with heavy oak doors and thick carpets, and suddenly, your word is the gospel truth. You become untouchable. A young girl speaks up, a girl who doesn't live in your zip code, a girl whose skin isn't the right color for your country club. And what happens? She's hysterical. She's crazy. She's exaggerating. She's a liar. Bumpy stopped pacing and squared his shoulders, facing the doctor directly. You lock the door, Bumpy continued, the velvet in his voice giving way to a harder, rougher texture. You use your position, your authority, the inherent trust people place in a healer, and if she dares to object, if she dares to assert her own dignity, you threaten to burn her future to the ground. You threaten to pick up a telephone and ruin her academic career before it even starts. That's the play, isn't it? That's the grand strategy of Dr. Arthur Sterling. No, I assure you, you have it all wrong. Save your breath, Doctor, Bumpy interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden, sharp drop in register hit Sterling like a physical weight, shutting the doctor's mouth instantly. The gravel in Bumpy's tone became pronounced, the refined Harlem gentleman giving way to the ruthless tactician who had survived 3 decades of street warfare. You are wasting my time, and you are insulting my intelligence, and I do not tolerate either. Bumpy took another step forward, closing the distance. Sterling pressed himself backward, trying to melt into the mahogany desk. You are fundamentally confused about your current situation, Bumpy said softly. You think you are still in your world. You think you are in a boardroom, or a courtroom, or a country club lounge. You think there is a judge here you can buy. You think there is a hospital board of directors you can manipulate with a donation and a smile. Look around you, Doc. Bumpy gestured lazily with his cigar, encompassing the dim, locked lobby. There is no judge here. There is no board of admissions. There is no police commissioner to take your frantic phone call. There is only me and my associate, and the absolute unavoidable truth of what you tried to do to my blood. Bumpy raised his left hand and pointed down the long, dark hallway that stretched behind the reception area, the hallway that led deep into the bowels of the clinic where the examination rooms were located. "Show us the room," Bumpy commanded. Sterling swallowed hard. His throat was so dry, it felt like it was coated in sand. The room? The room at the end of the hall, Bumpy specified, his tone flat and uncompromising. The room with the heavy lock on the inside. The room where you take the patients who don't have powerful fathers. The room where you practice your special brand of medicine. Walk. Sterling hesitated. His eyes, wide with sheer panic, darted toward the front doors. They were heavy, thick glass, reinforced with steel mesh. But beyond them, he could see the amber streetlights, the occasional passing taxi. Freedom. It was only 20 feet away. If he could just run, if he could somehow push past the massive man by the door and twist the deadbolt before they caught him, he could burst out onto Park Avenue and scream for help. Illinois Gordon read the desperate calculation forming in the doctor's mind before Sterling even twitched a muscle. Illinois shifted his weight just a fraction of an inch. It was a microscopic movement, but it completely altered the geometry of the room. He subtly blocked the path to the door, his massive, broad shoulders seeming to physically expand and fill the entire entryway. He looked like a mountain wearing a fedora. "I wouldn't," Illinois rasped quietly. His voice didn't carry a threat. It carried a promise. "You got nice legs, Doc. You wear expensive trousers. Be a terrible shame if those legs didn't work no more. Walking is a privilege. Don't throw it away on a stupid idea. Sterling's shoulders instantly slumped. The fleeting thought of escape evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow, sickening dread that settled deep in his stomach. The fight completely left his body. He realized he was not a man anymore. He was a ghost, waiting for the paperwork to be filed. He turned slowly, his shoes dragging against the carpet, and began to walk toward the dark hallway. Bumpy and Illinois followed behind him. The procession was agonizingly slow. It was a funeral march through the gallery of Arthur Sterling's immense hubris. The hallway was long and narrow, the floor covered in a thick burgundy runner that silenced their footsteps entirely. The walls were paneled in rich, dark wood, illuminated only by the faint, yellowish glow of the emergency lighting spaced evenly along the ceiling. Every few feet along the paneled walls hung framed photographs, diplomas, and commendations. It was a visual fortress of privilege, carefully curated to make anyone walking down this hall feel small, insignificant, and utterly dependent on the great doctor's mercy. Bumpy didn't rush. He stopped at the first framed photograph. "Hold on a minute, Doc," Bumpy called out softly. Sterling stopped instantly, his back rigid, terrified to move, terrified to speak. Bumpy stood before a large, silver-framed black and white photograph. It showed Dr. Arthur Sterling, looking 10 years younger and impeccably handsome, standing on the lush green fairway of an exclusive country club. He was shaking hands and sharing a hearty laugh with a man Bumpy recognized instantly. "Look at this, Illinois," Bumpy murmured, pointing the glowing tip of his cigar at the glass. "The good doctor here, teeing off with the district attorney of New York County, smiling like they own the world, sun shining, grass perfectly cut, drinking iced tea, while the rest of the city bleeds in the gutters." Square Cat's Illinois muttered from behind him, not looking at the photo, his cold, dead eyes locked permanently on the back of Sterling's neck. They think a piece of paper, a handshake, and a fancy tie makes them untouchable. They think the rules stop at 110th Street. They do, Bumpy agreed thoughtfully, tracing the edge of the silver frame with his finger. They truly believe it. He turned his gaze down the hall to Sterling, who was trembling visibly in the dim light. "You see, Doc, you operate under a grand, intoxicating illusion," Bumpy said, his voice echoing softly against the wood paneling. "You think because you live on Park Avenue, because you wear suits tailored in London and drink 20-year-old single malt scotch from crystal decanters, that you are a civilized man. You think you have evolved past the mud and the blood of the street. You think the rules of the jungle, the laws of consequence, simply do not apply to a man with your pedigree." Bumpy began walking slowly down the hall again, his eyes scanning the other photographs. Sterling shaking hands with the mayor, Sterling accepting a silver plaque at a society charity gala. "You look down from your penthouse on men like me," Bumpy continued, his tone conversational, almost philosophical. "You read the papers, you see my name, and you call us gangsters. You call us hoodlums. You sit at your dinner parties and call us animals. But I want you to tell me something, Arthur. I want you to really think about it." Bumpy stopped just 3 feet behind Sterling. The smell of fear rolling off the doctor was sharp and acrid, completely drowning out his expensive bay rum cologne. "I am a man of the streets," Bumpy said. "I make my living in the shadows. I do terrible things to terrible men, but I have rules. I have a code of honor forged in fire. I do not touch women. I do not touch children. I do not prey on the weak or the innocent. I protect my community. You take an oath to do no harm. And then you wait until you are alone in a room with a young girl, a girl half your age, a girl who came to you for help, and you use your power to try and break her spirit, to violate her dignity. So tell me, Arthur, which one of us is the animal? Which one of us belongs in a cage? Sterling didn't answer. He couldn't. His vocal cords were paralyzed. The philosophical dissection of his character was somehow worse than a physical beating. It stripped away every lie he had ever told himself about who he was. "Keep walking," Bumpy whispered. They reached the end of the hallway, the final door on the left. The heavy oak door of the examination room stood slightly ajar, exactly as Elise had left it when she made her desperate, frantic escape hours earlier. The darkness inside the room seemed to spill out into the hallway like thick, black ink. "Inside," Bumpy commanded. Sterling pushed the heavy wooden door open with a trembling hand and stepped into the small, sterile room. Illinois Gordon followed immediately behind him and reached past the doctor's shoulder, his large, gloved hand finding the switch plate on the wall. He flicked it upward. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed loudly, a harsh electric buzz, and flickered to life. The sudden, intense glare was blinding, clinical, and completely unforgiving. It stripped away the shadows and illuminated every corner of the room in stark, white detail. The room smelled intensely of medical-grade antiseptic, rubbing alcohol, and the lingering, heavy musk of Sterling's sweat. The room was surprisingly small, claustrophobic even. It was dominated by a heavy mechanical examination table positioned in the dead center. The table was covered in thick, dark brown leather padding, cracked slightly from years of use, complete with heavy steel stirrups resting at the base. To the right of the table sat a rolling stainless steel medical tray, covered in an array of instruments that gleamed coldly under the fluorescent lights. Bumpy walked into the room, his fedora still in his hand, his cigar clamped between his teeth. He didn't look at the trembling doctor right away. He took his time. He looked at the stark white walls. He looked at the frosted glass window that offered no view of the outside world. Then, Bumpy turned his attention to the door. He walked slowly back to the entrance and examined the heavy brass lock mechanism mounted on the inside of the thick oak. He reached out with his bare hand, running his long, elegant fingers over the cold metal casing of the deadbolt. A deadbolt on an examination room, Bumpy noted softly, tracing the outline of the lock. And not just a standard privacy lock, not a simple push-button mechanism to keep a nurse from walking in while a patient is undressing. This is a heavy-duty, industrial deadbolt. The brass is an inch thick. The throw extends deep into a reinforced steel strike plate in the frame. This is the kind of lock they use on bank vaults, Arthur, or solitary confinement cells at Rikers. Bumpy turned the heavy brass latch. Clack. The sound was shockingly loud in the small room. It was sharp, metallic, and heavy, the sound of a vault ceiling. Bumpy turned the latch back, retracting the bolt. Clack. "You had this installed custom, didn't you?" Bumpy asked, turning his head to look at Sterling. "You didn't want any accidental interruptions. You didn't want a receptionist knocking on the door. But more importantly, you didn't want anyone inside this room to be able to leave until you decided they were allowed to leave. You wanted absolute, unquestioned control. You built a soundproof locked cage in the middle of Park Avenue. I deal with highly sensitive cases," Sterling lied, his voice cracking, desperately clinging to the rehearsed excuses he had prepared over the years. psychiatric evaluations, high-profile executives undergoing nervous breakdowns. They demand absolute, impenetrable privacy. It's a standard procedure in my specific field. It's for their protection as much as mine." "Standard procedure," Bumpy echoed. He stepped away from the door and walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping right next to the heavy leather examination table. He looked at the doctor, a profound, chilling weariness settling into his eyes. "You think you can play word games with me, Arthur?" Bumpy asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly rumble. "You think you can jive me with your fancy, educated vocabulary? You think I haven't heard every lie, every excuse, every pathetic justification a man can invent to hide his true nature?" "My daughter did not come in here for a psychiatric evaluation. She did not have a nervous breakdown. She came in here for a standard physical required for her university enrollment. She was a healthy, vibrant, brilliant young woman with the whole world spread out in front of her." Bumpy took a deep breath, the cigar smoke curling around his face. "And you locked that deadbolt," Bumpy said, his voice tightening with a deeply suppressed volcanic rage. "You looked at my daughter, a queen walking into your clinic, and you didn't see a patient. You didn't see a human being deserving of respect. You saw prey. You saw an opportunity to exert your twisted power." Bumpy turned his attention to the rolling stainless steel tray. He looked down at the instruments neatly arranged on the sterile white cloth, a stethoscope with black rubber tubing, a blood pressure cuff, a small pen light for checking pupils, a tall glass jar filled with wooden tongue depressors. And then his eyes fell upon the heavy steel reflex hammer resting near the edge of the tray. Bumpy reached out and picked it up. He held it in his right hand, weighing it. He felt the balance of it, the solid, heavy density of the steel head, the textured grip of the handle. He turned it over, the fluorescent light catching the polished metal. "She hit you with this," Bumpy stated. It wasn't a question. He had already seen the purple, swollen bruising beginning to bloom across the knuckles of Sterling's right hand. Sterling instinctively flinched, pulling his injured hand closer to his chest, cradling it defensively against his lab coat as if the memory of the pain had just struck him again. "She has a wonderful swing," Bumpy mused softly. A fleeting, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a look of pure, unadulterated paternal pride. Her mother, Mamie, taught her how to carry herself like royalty. She taught her that she never has to lower her head to any man on this earth. And I taught her to always aim for the bone. Bumpy looked up from the hammer, his dark eyes locking onto Sterling's terrified face. "You're an incredibly lucky man, Arthur," Bumpy whispered. "You don't realize how lucky you are. You're lucky she only panicked and went for your hand. If she had remained calm, if she had aimed 3 feet higher and struck you in the temple with this piece of steel, you would be lying on a slab in the city morgue right now with a crushed skull. And I wouldn't have had to brave the cold wind tonight to come down here and clean up the mess." Bumpy casually tossed the reflex hammer back onto the stainless steel tray. It landed with a loud, jarring clatter that made Sterling violently flinch, his shoulders jumping toward his ears. "Please," Sterling begged. The word tore from his throat in a wet, ragged, pathetic sob. The final remnants of his dignity shattered completely. Tears finally spilled over his eyelashes, hot and fast, cutting messy tracks through the expensive, subtle foundation he wore to look tanned and healthy in the winter months. "Please, Mr. Johnson, I am begging you. I have money. I have a wall safe in my private office right down the hall. There is $50,000 in unmarked cash in there. You can have it. All of it. I can write you a certified check right now for 100,000 more. $250,000. Just name your price. Whatever you want. Take it and leave." Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He slowly raised his eyes from the tray and looked at the weeping, broken man before him. The absolute chilling emptiness in Bumpy's gaze caused the stream of desperate bargaining to dry up instantly in Sterling's throat. "Money," Bumpy said. The word dripped with a profound, almost philosophical disgust. "You think you can open a steel box and buy your way out of this? You think my daughter's dignity, her sense of safety, her honor, has a price tag attached to it? I know people." Sterling shrieked, sheer panic completely overwhelming his nervous system. He began backing away, shuffling his feet until his back was pressed flat against the far wall of the small room, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the two men. "I know the mayor. I play golf with the district attorney. I treat federal judges. If you touch me, if you lay one finger on me, they will hunt you down. They will unleash the entire police force on Harlem. They will destroy you. I am Dr. Arthur Sterling. You cannot do this to me. I am an important man." Bumpy took a slow, deep drag of his cigar. He let the smoke fill his lungs, holding it for a second, before exhaling a thick cloud right into the sterile, antiseptic air of the clinic. "You know the mayor," Bumpy nodded slowly, pretending to consider the information. "You know the DA. You treat judges. That's a very impressive resume, Arthur. It truly is. But let me explain a fundamental, undeniable truth of the universe to you right now." Bumpy took a slow, deliberate step toward the trembling doctor. "The mayor is currently asleep in his mansion on Gracie Square. The district attorney is drinking martinis at a cocktail party on the Upper East Side, completely oblivious to your existence. Your judges are safe in their warm beds. And you are standing in a soundproof, locked room with Ellsworth Johnson and Illinois Gordon. Your friends in high places cannot hear you scream. They cannot see you weep. And right now, in this very specific moment in time, their power, their influence, their laws, they mean absolutely nothing." Bumpy stopped just 2 feet away from Sterling. The air between them crackled with an invisible, lethal tension. "Right now, in this room, I am the mayor," Bumpy whispered, his voice dark and terrible. "I am the judge, and I am the executioner." Sterling let out a low, whimpering moan, shaking his head side to side, his eyes squeezed shut tight. "You see, Arthur, out there in the bright sunlight, your white coat makes you a god among men," Bumpy continued relentlessly. "But in the shadows, in the dark, the only currency that matters is consequence. You thought there would be no consequences for your actions today. You thought Elise was just another helpless, voiceless girl you could break for your own amusement. You miscalculated terribly." Bumpy slowly turned away from the doctor and gestured with his free hand toward the heavy leather examination table in the center of the room. "Put your hands flat on the table." The command was spoken softly, conversationally even, but it carried the immovable, crushing force of a falling anvil. Sterling's eyes snapped open. He looked at the heavy leather table. He looked at Bumpy. He shook his head violently, pressing himself harder against the wall as if trying to merge with the plaster. "No," Sterling sobbed, his voice breaking into a hysterical register. "No, please. God, no. I won't. I can't. Please, I'll do anything else. I'll leave the city. Please." Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat the command. He didn't even look at the doctor. He simply gave a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod to the doorway. Illinois Gordon moved. He didn't rush. He didn't lunge wildly like a brawler. He simply closed the distance between the door and the terrified doctor in two massive, silent, terrifyingly fast strides. Illinois grabbed the lapels of Sterling's pristine, custom-tailored white coat. He didn't just pull the doctor. He effortlessly lifted the grown man off his feet and hurled him forward. Sterling stumbled violently, his knees crashing hard into the heavy steel base of the examination table. Before he could even register the pain in his kneecaps, Illinois was upon him. Illinois stepped in close, driving his heavy knee firmly into the doctor's lower spine and pinning him over the edge of the table. With his massive left forearm, Illinois pressed down on the back of Sterling's neck, grinding the doctor's face into the dark leather to muffle his screams. This freed both of Illinois' steel cable hands to grip Sterling's forearms just below the wrists, locking the doctor's arms out straight and trapping his hands completely flat and exposed against the padding. Sterling thrashed wildly. He kicked his legs backward, his expensive leather shoes scrambling uselessly against the thick carpet. He twisted his torso, bucking his hips, his body convulsing in pure, primal, animalistic panic. But it was entirely futile. He was a small child struggling against a silverback gorilla. Illinois didn't even breathe hard. His massive chest rose and fell evenly. He held the doctor perfectly, rigidly still, completely neutralizing the man's frantic struggles through sheer, overwhelming physical dominance. Bumpy walked over to the table. He moved with slow, deliberate precision. He stood directly in front of Sterling, looking down at the doctor's manicured, trembling hands pressed flat against the dark leather. He took one final, long drag of his cigar. He stared down at Sterling's weeping, terrified face, twisted in agony beneath Illinois' crushing weight. Bumpy reached out to the stainless steel tray. He placed the glowing cigar carefully into a small, sterile kidney dish, resting the burning ash against the metal rim. He needed both hands for the work that was about to commence. Bumpy turned back from the tray and extended his right hand toward his enforcer. Illinois, without missing a beat or shifting his crushing weight, reached into his own heavy overcoat with his free hand. He pulled out a heavy, short-handled steel mallet, a tool of the street, brought specifically for the job, and placed it into Bumpy's waiting palm. It had a heavy, perfectly balanced cylindrical head and a taped grip to prevent slipping. It was a tool designed for brutal, necessary work. Bumpy held it by his side, letting the heavy steel head catch the stark glare of the fluorescent lights. When Sterling saw the mallet in Bumpy's hand, the last fragile remnants of his sanity completely fractured. The horrific reality of his situation finally crashed down upon his mind with the unimaginable weight of an ocean falling from the sky. These men had not come to extort him. They had not come for a payoff. They had not come to negotiate a truce or demand an apology. They had come to collect a toll in flesh and bone. "A surgeon's hands," Bumpy said softly. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. He looked down at Sterling's trembling fingers. The skin was pale, the fingernails perfectly manicured and buffed to a shine. "These are highly delicate, highly specialized instruments, aren't they, Arthur?" Bumpy continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a dark sermon. "Years of grueling medical training, decades of building a flawless reputation. These hands have healed people, I'm sure. They've performed complex procedures. They've perhaps even saved lives. They are the source of your wealth, your status, your immense arrogance." Sterling let out a muffled, agonizing, vibrating wail against the dark leather padding. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, tears streaming continuously down his cheeks. He was silently begging, pleading with his eyes for a mercy he had never once shown the terrified women he had locked in this very room. "But today, Arthur," Bumpy whispered, raising the heavy steel mallet slowly, holding it poised above the trembling hands. "Today, you made a choice. You chose to let these hands become instruments of terror. You tried to use these hands to soil something pure. You tried to use them to break something that belongs to me, and that is a transgression that the universe cannot simply ignore." Bumpy adjusted his grip on the textured steel handle. "There must be a balance to the universe, Doctor," Bumpy said softly. "When a rabid dog bites a child in the street, you don't negotiate with the dog. You don't offer it a bribe. You don't try to reason with it. You remove its teeth, so it can never ever bite again." Bumpy Johnson did not swing wildly. He did not strike in a blind frenzy of rage. That was for amateurs. That was for undisciplined street thugs. Bumpy was a professional. He was a craftsman of consequence. He brought the heavy steel mallet down in a sharp, incredibly precise, devastatingly fast arc. Crack. The sound was horrifyingly loud, a sharp, concussive report that echoed off the sterile white walls of the small room. It was the distinct, sickening sound of a dry, thick branch snapping under a heavy combat boot, magnified 10 times over. The flat, steel head of the mallet connected perfectly, squarely with the index and middle knuckles of Sterling's right hand. Sterling's entire body instantly arched completely off the floor in an explosion of pure, white-hot, blinding agony. His spine bowed backward, his legs kicking violently into the air. His scream was completely swallowed by the heavy leather table, resulting in a sickening, high-pitched, vibrating whine that echoed through the doctor's nasal cavity and sprayed a fine mist of spit and blood from his nostrils. Bumpy didn't pause to let the shock settle. The rhythm of the punishment had begun, and it required completion. He raised the mallet again, his eyes cold and focused entirely on the target. Crack. The mallet struck the ring finger and pinky of the right hand. The delicate metacarpal bones splintered instantly beneath the pale skin. The joints collapsed completely inward, pulverized under the immense focused pressure of the solid steel. The structure of the hand simply ceased to exist, turning into a flattened, misshapen mass. "You will never," Bumpy chanted softly, the cadence of his words matching the slow, methodical, rhythmic strikes of the steel, touch another woman against her will. Crack. He moved swiftly to the left hand. The heavy mallet fell directly onto the thumb joint. The bone was pulverized instantly into dust. Sterling was thrashing so violently now, his body convulsing in shock, that Illinois had to shift his massive stance. The enforcer pressed his heavy knee deeper into the doctor's lower spine, using his entire body weight to keep Sterling pinned flat against the edge of the table. The doctor's pristine white coat was rapidly becoming damp with terrified sweat. The smell of fear in the room was now absolute, a sharp, acrid biological stench that completely overpowered the medical antiseptic. "You will never," Bumpy continued, raising the mallet high again, "lock a door and make a young girl feel small." Crack. The index and middle fingers of the left hand gave way with a sickening crunch. Bumpy's precision was terrifying. The skin didn't break. There was no blood spraying across the sterile clinic to stain the pristine white walls or the doctor's coat. Bumpy was incredibly meticulous. He wasn't causing superficial lacerations. He was systematically destroying the complex machinery beneath the surface. He was ensuring that the intricate structural integrity of the bones, tendons, and nerves was permanently, irrevocably compromised beyond the reach of any modern surgical repair. Crack. The final, devastating strike landed squarely on the remaining fingers of the left hand. The job was done. Both of Dr. Arthur Sterling's hands, the very hands that had built his prestigious empire, the hands that had commanded such arrogant authority, the hands that had reached out to grab Elise Johnson, now lay completely flat on the dark leather padding. They no longer resembled human hands. They were ruined, twisted, flattened claws. They were already beginning to swell aggressively, the pale skin rapidly turning a dark, mottled, angry purple as internal bleeding flooded the pulverized tissue. Bumpy slowly lowered the mallet. He didn't drop it carelessly. He handed it back to Illinois, who slid it seamlessly back into his coat. Bumpy reached over to the stainless steel tray, straight to the kidney dish. He picked up his cigar. The cherry was still burning hot. He placed it between his lips and took a slow, deep puff, the glowing red light briefly illuminating his face in the harsh fluorescent glare. He looked perfectly, terrifyingly calm. His breathing was completely steady. His charcoal suit was not wrinkled. There was not a single drop of sweat on his brow. He looked exactly like a man who had just finished reading the Sunday paper in his parlor. Illinois Gordon looked at Bumpy, received a microscopic nod, and slowly lifted his crushing weight off the doctor's neck and spine. Dr. Arthur Sterling collapsed backward off the table, hitting the thick carpet like a puppet whose strings had been violently severed. He didn't scream. He couldn't. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the pain had pushed his nervous system entirely past the capacity for vocalization. He curled instantly into a tight, pathetic fetal position on the floor, drawing his knees to his chest. He cradled his ruined, purple, swollen hands gently against his chest, refusing to let them touch the carpet. He was emitting a low, continuous, bubbling, wet whimper that sounded barely human, a sound of absolute soul-crushing despair. He rocked back and forth uncontrollably, his perfectly styled silver hair now plastered flat to his forehead with cold sweat, his eyes squeezed shut against the agonizing, irreversible reality of his new existence. Bumpy stood over the broken man for a long, silent minute. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, smoking his cigar, letting the absolute totality of the destruction settle heavily into the atmosphere of the room. Then, Bumpy reached up with his left hand and casually adjusted the knot of his burgundy tie. He smoothed the lapels of his charcoal suit jacket. He crouched down, his movements slow, fluid, and graceful, until his face was only inches away from the whimpering doctor curled on the floor. Sterling flinched violently at the proximity, trying desperately to scramble backward across the carpet like a wounded crab, but his legs wouldn't obey him, and he had nowhere to go. He slowly forced his tear-streaked, bloodshot eyes open and looked directly into the calm, unblinking face of his destroyer. "Listen to me very carefully, Arthur," Bumpy whispered. The deliberate use of the doctor's first name in this moment was far more intimate and far more terrifying than any profanity or shouted curse word could ever have been. It signaled an absolute stripping of title, of rank, of humanity. Your medical practice is officially closed. Do you understand me? Sterling offered a pathetic, jerking nod, a wet sob escaping his lips. "You are going to call your landlord tomorrow morning," Bumpy instructed, his voice a low, soothing purr of absolute terror. You are going to break your lease on this beautiful Park Avenue suite. You are going to sell your expensive equipment to the highest bidder. You are going to retire to whatever fancy gated house you own out on Long Island, and you are going to spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life trying to figure out how to hold a simple cup of coffee with a pair of useless, broken claws. Sterling sobbed again, a hollow, shattered sound. But I want to be perfectly clear about the terms of your retirement, Bumpy continued, his voice dropping to a register so incredibly low it felt like a physical vibration in the floorboards. If I ever hear a whisper that you have opened another clinic, if I ever hear that you have so much as written a simple prescription for aspirin or put a stethoscope to a patient's chest in a charity ward, if I ever see the name Dr. Arthur Sterling printed in any medical directory in this state or any other, Bumpy leaned in closer. The rich, heavy smell of the Cuban tobacco washed completely over Sterling's face, mingling with the smell of the doctor's own terror. I will not come back here to break your hands a second time, Arthur, Bumpy whispered, his eyes entirely devoid of light. If you ever attempt to practice medicine again, your next appointment will be an autopsy. Bumpy held the broken doctor's gaze for 3 long, agonizing seconds, ensuring that every single syllable of the promise burned itself permanently into the deepest, most primal fear centers of Sterling's traumatized brain. Then, Bumpy stood up. He didn't look down at the man again. He simply turned away and walked toward the open door of the examination room. "Let's go, Illinois," Bumpy said casually, checking his gold wristwatch. "Mame is making a pot roast tonight, and I really don't want to be late for dinner." Illinois Gordon didn't utter a word. He looked down at the weeping, destroyed man writhing on the floor, gave a slow, satisfied nod of his massive head, and turned to follow his boss out of the room, leaving the blinding fluorescent lights burning brightly over the carnage. They walked back down the long, carpeted hallway in silence. They passed the framed portraits of powerful men smiling from the paneled walls. The faces in the pictures, once symbols of unassailable authority, suddenly looked incredibly fragile, like paper masks hiding from the fire. They walked through the quiet, luxurious reception lobby, their footsteps muffled entirely by the thick cream rugs. The smell of the cigar smoke lingered heavily in the air, a permanent reminder of the intrusion. Illinois stepped to the front doors and unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt. He pulled the thick glass door open, and the freezing, bitter autumn wind rushed inside instantly, furiously sweeping away the stagnant, perfumed air of the clinic. Bumpy Johnson stepped out onto the cold concrete sidewalk of Park Avenue. The prestigious street was mostly empty now, the wealthy denizens tucked safely away in their towering fortresses of limestone and glass, protected from the cold and the dark. The wind whipped violently at the hem of Bumpy's long charcoal coat, but he didn't seem to notice the freezing temperature. He stood directly under the halo of a street lamp, pulling the collar of his coat up around his neck. He took one final, long drag of his cigar, tasting the smoke, before tossing the stub into the gutter, where it hissed briefly against the damp pavement and died. A sleek, immaculate, pitch-black Lincoln Continental pulled silently up to the curb, its powerful engine idling softly in the night air. The driver, the massive bodyguard Nat, didn't ask any questions. He didn't look at the clinic. He simply reached over the front seat and pushed the heavy rear passenger door open. Bumpy climbed into the spacious, leather-scented back seat, followed immediately by the hulking, silent shadow of Illinois Gordon. The heavy door slammed shut with a solid, satisfying thud. "Take us home, Nat," Bumpy said quietly. He leaned his head back against the plush leather headrest and closed his eyes, the tension completely leaving his body. Take us back to Harlem. The big Lincoln pulled smoothly away from the curb, its bright red taillights bleeding into the darkness of the avenue, leaving the quiet, expensive artificial silence of Park Avenue far behind. High up in the clinic, trapped behind the heavy oak doors, the thick walls, and the custom deadbolts, Dr. Arthur Sterling continued to weep alone on the floor under the blinding fluorescent lights. He lay there mourning the brutal, sudden death of his arrogance, mourning the complete loss of his unchecked power, and realizing, for the absolute first time in his privileged, sheltered life, that there were monsters walking in the world far, far more terrifying than the ones he had spent his entire life pretending not to see. The King of Harlem had delivered his verdict, the shadows had spoken, and the streets, as always, remained undefeated.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.